absolutely. You called the meeting to order. I'm
All
sorry.
right.
Isn't it think about them?
It's 5:30, so we're going to call the meeting to order. This is a special meeting and work session to go over our 2018-2019 budget. It's our first work session of 3 work sessions, I believe, before we adopt the budget. And we're going to call Ben Rarick to present the preliminary budget information.
So if it'll work, maybe I'll just turn the slides from here. It seems somewhat impersonal than me standing up there while there's only 8 of us here at the table.
Okay, sure.
Is that all right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Fine, yes.
Okay. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. So there's quite a bit of data in this presentation, but I don't want to lose the forest for the trees here and just lay out some pretty basic goals. What am I actually pointing at when I do this?
You're pointing to the computer screen that way.
Is it on?
And
All right, I'll stand up
No,
there.
no, here's the most important test.
So I looked at the budget presentations you've had in prior years and tried to kind of segment the content in a similar way, but add some of my own personal style to it as well. And one of the things that's a little unique about this year is there are so many changes in the law recently that I thought it was a good investment on the front end to have a grounding in that. So first, to build some understanding of recent events. By events, I mean new laws, and to help understand the new revenue landscape, okay? I spend just a couple of slides. I didn't want to bog down into this, but a couple of slides about the past, my understanding of the past, and 2 slides, kind of where we were and how we got there and where we could go. And then finally, a landing spot that I had in mind for this evening was to really think about some guiding principles for the 1819 budget, rather than boring into a specific object code or activity code, like what, at the end of the day, what are the values of the board and how can I and we reflect those values and land in a place that makes sense for everybody. So I've been giving some presentations internally within the district where I've adopted this phrase, the next 5 months will set the stage for the next 5 years. And I really think that's true because we're kind of in a unique, there's been some unique events, some negative, some positive. The fact that we have limited, like no fund balance, right? And the fact that we're entering a landscape where the funding is really changing. We're getting some money and then we're losing some money, so. Any questions before I kind of embark on that? Okay, so this first slide is literally a walkthrough of the topics, okay? There's some slides on the context that we talked about. I have a series of slides about the changes in state law, the changes in funding, the kind of the levy swap concept that I'm sure that you've heard about in terms of increases in state revenue relative to decreases and how much we can raise locally. The new changes in the compensation laws with regards to parameters and limits. And then some major considerations for the 1819 budget and the 4-year outlook in terms of the not only getting to a 5% fund balance, but sustaining that over a period of time and not being short-sighted in that. Okay? All right, so I have this slide and this slide that are kind of, I think encapsulates most of the important narrative about kind of how we got to where we are. The first slide is the slide that everybody looks at, and the second slide is the slide I think everybody should look at, okay? The first slide is the one you've seen, which is just a depiction of the district's fund balance since school year 11-12, right? Everything's blue. You see the dotted line, which is 5% fund balance. And of course, that number changes every year because 5% is a different number, right? But just for illustrative purposes, right? And for a while there, district was doing just fine in terms of a fund balance. But one of the things that's noteworthy about this graph is if you erased school year 15-16 and 14-15, and you just drew a line, like if you just drew a trend line in terms of where you were going to land in 16-17, which is what I did, you come pretty darn close to where we actually landed, which was negative 5.6 million. So there is a clear trajectory that materialized in 13-14, 14-15, 15-16 that just happened to manifest in 16-17. But the problem with this graph is it makes it seem like the problem popped up in 16, 17. So let's look at this next graph. And this is the graph I think people should be looking at, which is that, and I think this question was asked by I think it was Director Hanscom. This graph shows the relationship of revenues to expenditures within a given school year. So going all the way back, 12-13 was the last year that the district received more revenues than it spent. And then every year subsequently, and then starting at 14-15, there's been a structural annual operating deficit of roughly $10 million, give or take, on each side for 3 straight years. And so this graph really kind of gives you the portrait that really the problem materializes much, 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 much earlier, and it simply manifested last year, okay? Okay, so that was a little bit about the past, and now we're gonna spend some time kind of learning up on what is happening to us. What did the legislature do? How does it impact how we do our business? The first 2 slides are a look at our local revenue situation. I'm just dealing with M&O levies, okay? And the blue bar is what you think of as the M&O levy, that local excess levy. It's what the voters approve. The little red on top of that is the LEA that we get from the state, all right? So 2 things are about to happen. So the state is about, well, they have already passed in law this new cap of $1.50 per thousand that we can raise, right? All right, now this graph you'll see is based on calendar years, okay? Calendar year 17, 18, all the way through 22. We don't budget on calendar years. We budget on school years, right? So we get a little slice of each one of these, right? But just before we go to the next slide, it should pop up the page that, you know, the size of these local levies is going to drop very considerably, and then the projected growth of those local levies is pretty modest, okay? Both the blue bar and the red bar in the same way. They're both diminishing, and then they're both growing in a limited manner, okay? So then you're saying, okay, well, you're showing me the calendar year, show me the, so this one shows you the school years, right? It takes the combined effects. And I gotta say that OSPI sent a spreadsheet like yesterday morning with their new levy projections, and mine are a little different than theirs, but you know, by the time we get to the budget, they'll be final. But just take a look here. When I started with that concept that the next 5 months kind of sets the stage for the next 5 years, this is one critical part of it, because there is a significant influx of state money, which we're going to talk about in a subsequent graph, but there's also a significant decrease from local levy, right? And that doesn't really bottom out. You see that note there? There's a note above the 1920 school year. So not next year, but the year after next year is the year in which we quote unquote bottom out, where that number is going to be the lowest that it's going to be. And so if we're smart about this, we've got to plan for that, right? Because the state did not phase in their increase in funding, but they did phase in the decrease in local levy, okay? Any questions about that? That's a really key concept to understand here. Okay? So a couple times I've been in meetings, somebody will come up to me and say, I heard Kent School District's getting $75 million more money from the state. And I always say, well, you know, I want to put that in context for you, because we're getting some money and we're losing some money, right? So this graph helps you understand on a year-to-year basis what we're getting and then what we're losing and what the net of that is. And then in subsequent slides, I'm going to share a little bit about how that state money breaks apart in detail, because it's not just one big chunk. It comes in individual programs, and each program has different requirements. Okay, does that make sense? So the red bars are the amount in rough terms that we expect levy and LEA to drop. Those will correspond to the charts you just saw, right? The blue bar, which is really not showing up all that well on the screen, but can you see it? It's kind of a light aqua-ish blue. That is the amount of the projected increase in state funding. Okay, notice it's high in the first year and then levels out very quickly. All right, and then the green bar is the net in each year. Okay, make sense? Okay. So then, remember on this previous slide here, that aqua that says 75 million on it? So one of the things I wanted to give you a sense of here is, okay, people tend to think of that as like just kind of a chunk of money.
Giant check.
Right, a
Yeah.
giant check, no strings attached, here's a giant check. So I wanted you to get a flavor for the fact that this money comes in a variety of different accounts, programs, and those programs have a variety of different restrictions associated with them, right? So I've represented that both in pie chart form on the left and in a little data table on the right. So my takeaway from this, I think it's very important, is that there's some of these programs, let's take, career and technical education, let's take LAP, okay, inclusive ed. Some of these programs where they're earmarked for a specific purpose, and if you don't spend that money for that purpose in a given year, you may have to give back some money, right? There's recovery rates, right? That's not true for other programs like our general apportionment allocation, right? So when we get an influx of LAP money, part of our job is to understand, okay, we want to make sure that we are responsible in the sense that we're spending that money to the rate where we're going to have to send money back to the state, right? So that has implications both for what it's spent on and how it's spent, okay? So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different accounts that this money is coming in. The top one, the largest, is arguably the most flexible. But once you start working down that list, each one of these programs has its own specific regulatory environment. Okay? Any questions about that before I keep moving on?
Are all of those, if we don't spend them, have to be sent back, or is it just specific?
Not every
ones?
single one of them. So some of these have recovery, have categorical restrictions and recovery rates, some of them don't. So I know that LAP has recovery restrictions. Hey Lisa, does special ed have recovery restrictions?
No, let me see,
Bilingual
bilingual.
does.
Uncapable bilingual.
So it's a mix.
Pedagogical programs typically work.
So most all of these are categorical, and then within that, some of them are categorical and have recovery rates. And so it's just important, I'm trying to kind of contextualize this increase in funding. It's not all in one big pot. Should I, I'm trying to pace myself here, we're good, keep going? Okay. All right, so the next few slides try to give you a flavor for historically in the last 4 budget cycles, what our growth rates have been. So I have one on year-to-year growth overall, and then one when I get into object codes. Okay, so the first one is starting with 12-13 is the base and moving forward. We were growing at a pretty significant rate. The couple years over 10%. This is aggregate, okay, aggregate general fund. 1 year at 7.3%, and then 16-17 when I think the realities of those earlier slides started to present themselves. 16-17 did slow a bit, but still pretty forward-leaning rates of growth, shall we say.
Do we know where we think 17-18 is going to come in?
We do. I knew that was going to come up. I was hoping we could park it and then get,
Yeah,
can we do that one at
that's
the
fine.
end? Okay. I'm not evading the question. If we get to that, it'll be a whole thing in
Yeah.
itself, right? So this is the same look as this, except for then I thought you might have the question, well, this is an aggregate. Can you give me some sort of detail on this rate of growth? So this breaks that out over those years and looks at specific object code growth, okay? So it says certificated salaries, but that growth can be in both the increase in the salary or the number of people in that object, right? So I want to be really clear about that. It's just the amount that is spent on compensation in it, right? And so you can see that about 85% of the expenditures in those first 3 bars, okay? Everything to the right is, other than contract services, a relatively bit player. And you can see capital outlay, we've, for smaller pieces of equipment, that growth rate has gone down considerably, but that's a very, very small number, so,
Ben,
yeah.
where in this chart
Is it this one or this one?
The previous one, the year
Yeah.
the spending,
Yep.
either one, have we identified exactly where we had the largest variance in the budget?
Variance from the budget
Yeah.
to expenditure?
Yes.
We have. I don't have a chart for it, but it's easy enough to show. That's, so we're keeping a list of the questions you have. Let me get my scratch pad here.
Okay. I'm trying to understand, if we had a budget that was supposed to be balanced, where did we go wrong here?
Right, I think what you're trying to reconcile, I'm looking back at, I'm all the way back on, let's say, I don't even know the page. Annual growth general fund revenues to expenditures. We had a budget surplus of 3.1, ended at negative 9.455.
Yeah, so let me get that for you.
Kind of like saying like,
That one?
okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So we had some assumed growth in expenses. I don't know what that number is.
Yeah.
It's a number.
Yeah.
It ended up being, I'm looking at 15, 16 to 16, 17, ended up being 4.1%, which is the low of that, of the four numbers that are on there. And so I think that's at least, that's the most recent example of like, if we ended up at 4.1%, seems like we might have budgeted 0, I guess, less than, a number that was a lot lower. And that's kind of setting the stage for making sure we don't do that again. We don't say, oh yes, we know we can keep to 2% growth when we know we can't.
Right, so am I
And I
understanding?
took that my way. so
Well,
that's why you were
I'd like
taking
to
that.
know the specifics, not the percentages, I understand that part, but where did we go wrong in our assessment of, where we should have budgeted versus what we should have budgeted
Yep.
versus what we spent?
So let me make sure I understand so I come back with something that's responsive. So essentially, the relationship and the variance of what was budgeted versus what was expended over a couple of years, we know is considerably off. But you wanted to see something a little bit
Specific,
more
where are
detail,
we-
like at an object level or something?
Yes, at
Okay.
the object
All right.
level. Because the enrollment, when we look at
I
how
actually think we
we,
already have a chart for that, but we'll get you that.
how we did the enrollment projections, you can clearly see that your demonstration of
Yeah.
that was really, really helpful
Oh,
to
good,
me.
good.
Where exactly we went wrong in that, not only the year, but in terms of, which portion
Yeah.
of the enrollment projections,
Yep.
the K through 12,
Yep.
is where we went wrong.
Yep.
That was really eye-opening to me, and so I think to that level of detail, we need to see in order to make sure we're budgeting properly.
Sure.
Thank
I can do that.
thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna go back. All right, so we kind of, just to keep the through line here of what I was trying to do here. So we went over kind of the local funding terrain, right? and What's changing in the outlook. We went over the state funding terrain and what is changing, both from an outlook standpoint and also looking at this projected increase in funding for 18-19, okay? And then we went over some of the growth rates, all right? So now, we talked about how so much has changed in the law and some of the impacts that it could have on Kent. In many respects, Kent's not really unique every district's gonna be kind of operating in this new normal. I'll try to highlight for you I think something just for Kent, but for the most part, your colleagues in other districts are gonna be having the same conversation. So one of the things that I've really been thinking about as I've tried to build out like a 5-year outlook is there was growth before and growth after. And when I say before and after, I'm talking about last session when they made all these changes. And really, the growth that school districts experienced in revenues, like say pre-2016, 17, some years could be really good. Because take them one at a time. So It used to be, you remember Initiative 732 with the state COLAs? That was always tied to the consumer price index, right? Which was always the more, the higher of the variety of inflationary measures available to one. And that's not the case anymore. So they changed the law such that the money, the adjustments that the district will get for compensation are tied to the implicit price deflator, which is sometimes half of CPI. I mean, it's not formal, but you know, I mean, if you eyeball it over time, it's almost always less, and it's sometimes half is less. And so that can mean after we get over this 2-year hump of major changes in funding, just projecting our basic growth, it's going to be less growth from a salary standpoint. Look at that third bullet there. So before all these changes, you know, last couple years ago, you were, I think last calendar year, you raised something like $73 million in your local levy. And that increased a good bit over the years. And one of the reasons it increased is because the formulas that were crafted in Olympia about how much more you could do each year was premised on growth in other funding categories. So as your other funding categories went up, your state money and your federal money, you got to raise more locally. And it worked out well for school districts. And some years your local levies would increase, you know, 5, 6, 7, sometimes 10%. The new law doesn't do that. The new law says you get to raise $1.50 per thousand. If property values go up, then you'll benefit from that. If property values go down, you won't benefit from that. And my concern is that we're on the precipice. I mean, property values have been going high for consecutive years, and these things don't go forever, right? So I'm kind of worried about that, as I say, the gate swinging both ways. So not to give you too much data, just to say the future from just a standard growth standpoint is not quite as rosy as the growth that districts experienced from the previous decade. And that's an important part of thinking about an outlook and thinking about commitments made in the future.
I had one question. This was just, because I know the cap is $1.50 per assessed value or
Yep.
$2,500 per student.
Yep.
And I think we're nowhere near that. Do you know
Correct.
how close we are
I
to
do.
that?
I do. So if you'll just bear with me as
Yeah.
I pop around a little bit. Okay, so for as long as that bar shows red, we're under the $1,500 because
Gotcha.
LEA is calculated
LEA.
on the basis of us
At
not
that.
being at 1,500. So you see we're projected to kind of catch up to the $1,500 bar based on what we think are, you know, or based on what the ESD thinks is reasonable assessed value growth over a period of time, but that could change. But, you know, we're an LEA district, but we're within shot of reaching that threshold and in danger of losing our LEA. It's a mixed blessing because that would mean we're raising more with our levy, but then we're losing the offset. Did that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, go back to where, oop, what happened there? That wasn't good. So, going into the state laws a bit, takeaway from this one is the new norm is lower growth. Takeaway from this one. A number of changes that were made in the law have a delayed effect on a lot of districts and a delayed effect on the Kent School District to the negative. So yes, we did receive a significant influx of state money next year, but there's some, as I call them, bills in the mail. Okay, we haven't received the bill yet. We have to plan for the bill. We're not going to get the bill in the next year, but we'll get it the year after that. So here's, or in some cases, the year after that. So here's 3 of them. We talked about the local levy cap. I won't belabor that point, but that doesn't really take full effect for another 2 years. The second one is the SEB, the School Employees Benefits Board. So I have spent some time trying to untangle this with Mariah and some of my colleagues, and we're all concerned in the field, my job alikes in other districts, about the way that the law changes the minimum requirement for full benefit coverage. So what happens is that they have stipulated in the law that the threshold for covering somebody full-time, with full benefits has been dropped in terms of the number of hours that you work. Well, that's great in terms of we're taking care of our people, and that's an excellent part of it. But it's an unfunded mandate in the sense that they basically are dropping that threshold and putting a bill on us, but we're still being funded on a headcount basis for that. So, districts are thinking that this cost to them is in the millions. I have a colleague in the Meade School District that's really into this and is in the task force, and he thinks for Meade it's like $3 million a year. So for Kent, it could be north of that. Now, it's not too late to lobby for changes to that, whatever, but that takes effect in January of 2020, which is in the middle of not next year, but the year after that. And so I've had tried to build a little placeholder in my long-range plan to say, okay, we gotta, until that gets fixed, if it ever does, there's a cost for us there.
Do we have a rough idea yet of how many that is, or what the impact?
Oh, in terms of the head count of it is? Not one I'm willing to spit out yet. If you give me another week, I might be able, I'm working
Fair
on
enough.
that, yeah. And then the last one is class size compliance, which again is not a bad thing. I mean, I don't want to portray it that way, but what it means here is that to the extent that that requirement merely gets deferred a year, and then another year, and then another year, it means that wherever we're at now, there is another group of teachers that would need to be hired in that year, whenever it is, and now it's 1920, but they've kicked this can a couple times, that would need to be hired. Well, there isn't more funding coming for that. That funding's been provided, so it's just on the expenditure side. So if it's next year, our latest number was about 40, right? And that number, I would imagine, would move around a bit, but 40 teachers is not an insignificant amount of money. So,
What about the other side of that? So that's 40 teachers that hit general fund, but capitalize as far as our actual buildings and locations for those teachers.
yep. The class size to be able to support.
Right.
They keep
yeah.
pushing it down because they don't have the space.
Yep.
There's no funding for space.
Yeah, no funding for space, yeah.
Okay. Okay, and then there were a whole series of changes associated with compensation. Now, I'm going to say to you right away that I know the interpretation of this law is pretty controversial. I'm giving you my best read of what I'm reading, but I also need you to know that as you walk away, people have different interpretations of this law, and my interpretation may not be shared by the entire community, but we do our jobs. So, basically the heart of the McCleary case was this idea that there was a big gap between what districts were already paying and what the state was funding for a given teacher or a given administrator or whatever. And that was what was unconstitutional. That was the original unconstitutionality finding, was that local levies were being used to pay for the basic education salaries of teachers and administrators and classified staff. And so the result was the state increased the allocation for all those three groups, okay? Notice I said increase the state's allocation to the districts for those three groups, which is independent of what the districts pay for those three groups, okay? They're kind of catching up for years of having not fully funded the actual cost of paying for a staff person. So a couple of really significant changes in the law. First, that state salary allocation model that you probably have all been shown over the years, it's gone. There's no more state SAM. So this concept of staff mix, I don't know if that's a term that has been introduced in the past, but the concept of the state kind of subsidizing the seniority of the teachers in a given district, and so if Mercer Island has more senior teachers, then can't they get more money? That's also gone. And replacing it is this idea that each district gets a regionalization adjustment, right? We're an 18% regionalization district. It also created this idea of kind of what's come to be known as the fence posts. So they increased the allocations to district, and then they said, okay, your minimum salary has to be at least, the salary after 5 years needs to be at least, and your highest salary can be no more than. And then it provided, and this is where it gets a little bit more people having a diversity of opinions about what the language means, but it's indisputable that there is language in the law that talks about inflation-based limits for the 18-19 school year tied to the consumer price index and salary steps. And so if you really wanted to understand this in great depth, I can help you do that. But off to the side of this graph, I've created a link to WAXA's frequently asked questions, where they've essentially cataloged all the little ins and outs questions that people have had about this, and and hired some attorneys and did a great job of answering each and every one in detail. And I find it a very impressive document. So just by clicking on the electronic version of it, you could, or I can walk you through it too. I'm just giving you some resources.
So, and compensation parameters are inclusive of all benefits and all compensation?
Almost. I mean, so the compensation parameters that were part of 6362 pertain principally the 2018-19 school year, and were based on salary. And then everything, when we talk about other benefits, like health benefits, SEB is kind of their answer to that. So they didn't really create any limits necessarily, but just said, we're going to have a new state program in 2 years. Can't really think of any other limits beyond like
Expense base are
compensation.
specifically for the base salary. And then when we look at what can be applied to the cap, we have to look at the whole compensation and ensure that it still meets the fence posts, which it would, because a portion of it is the base anyway. It's two different sections of the law, and it's made it a little bit complicated. But
We will pause on that one. More questions or?
we can provide additional information too on that.
Okay, and then another really significant change, and one that is pretty timely. We're getting a lot of new guidance from OSPI, and people are kind of trying to figure out across the land what this means for their school district, is this idea of the future local levies. So we talked about the size of them going down, but also the legislature really changed the language of describing what can and can't be spent out of local levies. And they created this term called enrichment, and that levies are limited to enrichment activities. And because I find the definition of enrichment to be so difficult to pin down, and I'm not alone in that, I just went ahead and pasted the slide in there that I got, so you can kind of struggle along with me to see, like, you can see that there's, I mean, my interpretation of it is they're trying to do their job, but they're trying to provide enough definitional flexibility to do some sense making around it. But you'll see there in the bottom of that slide, permitted enrichment activities consist of extracurricular, extended days or school years. Any additional salary costs attributable to the provision or administration of those activities. But if it's not part of one of those enrichment activities, not allowed. Another part of this law is that not only are we limited to this definition of enrichment, but the next time we go out for an M&O levy to the voters, we submit a plan to OSPI and say, here's how we would intend to spend this next levy of $52 million or whatever it is at that time. And here's how that money would be limited to enrichment. And OSPI is kind of putting together the process of how they would approve that and how stringent or lenient they would be, and they're struggling as well. So I say, uncertain future for regulatory guidance. The current superintendent of public instruction has not been eager to jump into this fray. And then they also did something kind of a little bit one-off, where they put a cap on administrative compensation paid for out of the local revenue subfund. And so they're supposed to adopt rules to tell us exactly what that means and how that would measure it. And And I'm hearing now that they're not going to do that, so it'll be interesting to see how that goes. Okay? So I've given you a lot of information, and I got a couple slides here at the end to try to kind of,
So can we go back to the one, because there's one question,
Yes.
sorry. So have.
How far back?
Just one more forward. So on this one,
Yes.
so have we started to do any type of analysis? I mean, I know it's this vague
Yes.
enrichment type thing.
Yeah.
But I would imagine that some of the things that we do currently with
Yeah.
local levies don't fit in enrichment.
right,
And so that money then has to then be transferred to the general fund.
yep.
So have we started to look at what that really means for us?
We've taken a first cut at it.
Okay.
There's kind of two prongs to this. One is, it's less policy relevant, but it's a really significant headache, is it changes the whole accounting structure for school districts in the state. And so we've spent a fair amount of time trying to understand what that change in the accounting structure will do to us. The second component is on the costing side, which I think is more of what you're talking about. You know, if we had to come up with a good faith, you know, absent like more specific definable guidance, a good faith demonstration of what enrichment is, what would we do? We've had a couple of conversations with other districts about what they're thinking about that. One of the things that's come out of the guidance is that anything that is above what the state funds is de facto enrichment. So if we fund like 25 nurses, I think it is, and the state gives us 2 or 4 or whatever it is, whether or not we consider that to be basic to the program of students, from a regulatory standpoint, we can make the case that it's an enrichment piece, and we can justify that. So there's definitely some nuances to work through, but thankfully, we're not alone in this. Every district's having to do the exact same thing.
But is the state's not giving us the same type of mix that they did before, right? We're saying
Correct.
2 to this, so part of that then is left up to districts to do. I just want to make sure I'm tracking,
Yep.
right? So before they said, okay, you can have X number of nurses,
Yep.
X number of this, and
Yep.
here's your money to fund this for a
Yep.
district your size.
Yep.
Now they're saying, hey, we're not giving you that guidance, we're just giving you the money and you use it how you, or are they still doing some of that?
They're still doing the allocation model.
Okay,
They're
still the allocation,
Yeah, so
okay.
we're still getting a certain number of staff FTE in the formula.
Okay.
In the prototypical school model, but we don't have to spend it in accordance. There's a
Okay.
couple of exceptions to that, but we don't have to spend it in exact accordance with how they've allocated it. Districts have some flexibility to make some decisions that are
But they
local
didn't do
flavor.
any adjustments in those, saying, you know, a district of our size, 27,000, that the amount of nurses, for example.
Yeah,
They
not to my
didn't do
knowledge. Are
any
you-
mix? No,
Not
okay.
unless you know something I don't, but.
No.
Yeah, yeah, not that I've heard. I would know too, so no.
Okay.
So the other thing that I didn't include in here, but is important to know, is that districts are all struggling with this right now. And like with SIPSI, for example, the organization that would set up the accounting structure to be able to even have a sub-fund, has already sent a letter to the state saying, listen, you would have had told us this 8 months ago to. So the state auditor issued a letter and said that, you know, that compliance with this provision in the first year, this is considered an official transition year. And so districts are being held to kind of a good faith standard. What that means exactly is, but, you know, there's an acknowledgement that some of the stuff came at the very late breaking manner. Okay, so I have a couple more slides here. One about the calendar, and then one about kind of talking about guiding principles and what your needs are and questions are. First, as it relates to the calendar, and I have some dates on here, but I also put as an appendix here the slice from this is from OSPI's page in terms of the actual dates in the manual. So if you have any questions about why a date is a certain way, we've just basically tried to backward plan from those dates, okay? So, you know, my goal tonight was to try to really accomplish two big things, which was give you a good grounding in our preliminary estimates of the revenue piece, okay, which I think we've accomplished, I hope. And the second thing is give you a good grounding in the major statutory changes that are going to change our lives, okay? And I hope we've achieved those things. The next time that we have a work session, I'm hoping to get on the expenditure side. So now that we work towards a 4-year budget outlook, now we know the revenue piece, are pretty darn close. Next iteration will be as we complete the staffing process. I mean, take a really good look at, with the decisions been made about staffing allocations in schools, and where do we sit on the expenditure side of the equation. And so that would, my hope is that that would occur on the 20th. And then I want you to have a flavor for how these dates set out, because my last question of you tonight is really going to be like, what do you need in terms of your questions you need answered and things you want done in the process, because now is the time for us to be dealing with that. But June 29th is the date that districts make a preliminary F-195 submission, and then late August is when that budget gets adopted. But we will be transmitting some data file on June 29th, and then we're not prohibited from adjusting that in the series of public meetings that occur thereafter, but it's an important first part of the process, particularly given where we've been, for the EST to have a full technical review, which would commence on that date. So any questions about those dates? And also, I tried to come up with kind of 3 kind of conceptual takeaways here to try to make sense of all this data and information you've been given. And to give you a sense of how I'm thinking about this, and to seek some affirmation or not of these things, and to share kind of my thinking about it. The first is that I think the challenge for Kent is going to be less about complying with 5% at any particular point, but how to sustain that. As we talked about this, ebbs and flows over the next few years, the sustaining part is harder than the getting to. And so my kind of lens is not where we're ending in 18-19, but as you see in that subcomponent, what does it take to end in good shape after 2021? And I was describing this to somebody a couple of days ago, and it's like, and this hits close to home for me. If you have kids, and you know that 2 of them are going to be college, they have overlapping years in college, and they're both going to be in college at the same time, you might be okay now, but you got to plan for that year when both your kids are going to both be in college at the same time. Are you going to be okay with that? That's really the threshold question. And our situation's not all that different from that. And then number 2, so remember that pie chart where I tried to break out for you that, to give you a flavor for the different types of funding that comprise the total state increase. Well, there's good alignment to the strategic plan goals in some of these programs. So there's a significant increase in lab funding, which is, targeted to struggling students. If we don't fully expend those monies, we send it back. So, there's going to be an opportunity to make some modest investments in the areas where the strategic plan identifies, addressing opportunity gaps. Transitional Bilingual is another program that experienced a meaningful increase in funding. And then the third thing I've been thinking about is how to connect with the community on this. It's obviously a huge issue. I'm hoping work sessions like this help do that, but I know that you've had conversations with the superintendent, but I want to make clear my desire and hope to kind of put this in terms that create meaning around the budget for the community. And I have thoughts about that. We've been working on that, both in terms of ways we can display key performance measures, not wonky ones, but ones that just people who are not budget professionals would want to see, not developing metrics for our own selves, but for other audiences. So there's momentum around that. And, we've been talking about just turning the page on this and working towards being a best practice district. Like, what would it take if we had to sit down and write, in 4 years, if somebody's going to say Kent is the model in this regard, what would that look like? Allow us to think about that rather than be kind of, tethered to the past in that regard. So that's the material I have for you. There's some appendices too that I thought might be helpful. I already went through this slide with you in terms of kind of next time. But there is a sheet on, you were talking about CPI and IPD, and gave you that. I've had so many questions about it, I thought I'd just stick it in here. This is the multi-year tool page. I keep getting the questions about it, I just put it in there.
Yeah.
So there it is for you. I'll help you interpret it if you want. And then there's those are the timelines that are put in the budget manual from OSPI that we've tried to backward plan from. I hope that was helpful, and let me know if you have any questions or needs or thoughts about what I could respond to next time we meet. I already have one.
In the LAP, transitional bilingual and inclusive education increases, are those, as far as we know, are those going to stay at a higher level? We're not going to get the rug ripped out from underneath us
That's a good
2 years
question.
from now?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Because if we invest in people, then that's going to be a problem again.
Absolutely. Yeah, I could never sit here and guarantee, right?
Yeah.
I guess the only meaningful thing I can say about those is that if the state did cut those programs, they would have a constitutional fight on their hands because those are part of the program of basic ed. There are other things they can cut that wouldn't necessarily pose the same, but where did it go? All right, there we go. So the littler slices of pie there. CTE is another one.
To kind of address the transition bilingual, that one, there's two funding sources. There's the state, that's state funding, and then there's Title III, which is the federal funding. And so this increase, although it's an increase, it's nowhere near what we need to support the staffing we have in it now. We'll take that, but it does help us from a basic ed standpoint. We're able to continue to whittle away for the amount of basic ed that we're spending, and we're still always asking for more. Federal is not as much of an increase, but we do have those.
But I have lots of questions. I don't know if you want to go first.
I have another one too.
Got it.
So just on the, Ben, on the future of local levies page, the enrichment page, the last bullet is 25% cap on administrative compensation in the local revenue subfund. I don't know what that means.
Okay. What slide was that in the early?
The enrichment one where you just pasted the OSPI.
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, it is complicated and was not a particularly well-written piece of legislation. But here is what I have come to understand that to mean. So if the district pays for administrative, and they did not define administrator in the law, by the way, so it's a question of like, I'm a classified administrator, am I, just a lot of these types of questions. If the district pays for compensation, I don't think it said salaries, but compensation for administrators above and beyond what the state allocates, then it cannot spend more than 25% of local revenue for that purpose. And obviously, there's a ton of yeah buts about that, right? So, well, yeah, but what's an administrator? That's a legitimate question. If it's just certified administrators, that's one thing. If it's people we call administrators that might be classified, that's another. What's compensation? What's in and out? Every district is struggling with this particular provision. But the intent, I think part of the debate was that it was important to the legislature that these local levies be for true enrichment, and they didn't want it like overly populated with, but the fact of the matter is, vast majority of districts, administrator compensation is well beyond what they're receiving, so it's a bit of a conundrum. to answer your question, the details of how that was calculated, not clear.
Thank you.
Perhaps intentionally so.
Less questions, more of what to see next. So we talked about what we're gonna see next time. But I think I wanna make sure, like, at some point, I wanna see a 4-year projection. You mentioned how we're gonna be in 2021, I'd say
Yep.
2021, 21, 22. Like, that's kinda what I wanna see when we think about sustaining a
You'll
fund
get that.
balance, sustaining a surplus deficit, whatever we do.
Yep.
And then, so like, we talk about a lot of changes in state revenue fund. We made a lot of changes in our expense model this year. Structural changes, things like
Yep.
that. Want to be able to highlight what those are as we compare 18-19 to 19-20. And even as those changes take effect in 18-19, what it looks like the year beyond that. It's just an example. I mean, it's mostly people. But like, what does that impact? And be able to identify that.
So the structural changes in spending from a 17-18 base to what's proposed?
Yeah.
Or, okay.
And so, let's say we'll look at, here is increase in administrative spending. Maybe it's whatever that is, 4%. Here's how much was a change from what we already did, and then here's other things,
Okay.
general increase
Okay.
in whatever.
All right.
But then also taking into consideration, if the law gets put in place where we have to increase staff, right, for the K-3 funding.
Right.
What that
What
looks
that
like
looks like.
in there as well.
We went down in a staffing rate because it was delayed a year. What does it look like when it's back in? And we go from there. And then this is more of a question if you're able to provide it, if we've looked at it in the past.
Okay.
School-based information in terms of here's the school, here's how much it receives from the general fund, here's how much it receives from LAP, all these different areas, just so we know, I don't know, and year over year, more of like, it's just if we have that and if we have looked at it in the past. Not for any particular school, like for all the schools.
Okay. Lisa's shaking her head, so we must be
Okay,
able to do
good.
something.
I'm already planning when we publish the actual budget book, we call it the user-friendly budget document. It's gonna have more pages, just exactly like that, by school, to that level of detail, their staffing, their funding.
Anything like do things for program-based too, so like, I'm thinking like Running Start, or here's how much we spend regardless of school across the district on these various programs. Just to see what that is, because it's gonna touch different objects, if that's the right word. And then where that looks in overall spending regardless of object.
Sure. Well, one thing I neglected to mention is that we absolutely will do that 4-year outlook, because now it's a legal requirement. It's actually now part of 6262 that all school districts have to do a 4-year budget, so. But we are, just so you know, I absolutely am doing that and will present it.
This is more of a general question. We look at how we're meeting. How do we give you input about the different scenarios we want to see? I want to see what if it looks like if we, I don't know, whatever that is, how do we give that input and get that response in a timely manner?
So I think, because there's infinite scenarios, right? So I think we need to start now, earlier rather than later. And part of what I was saying there with those guiding principles is, I think of the scenarios as, if there's a value or a condition that you want met, right? I mean, it's one thing to like, what if we increased object, granular, but just, if you had a condition like, I don't want to get past X year without a minimum 5%, what would it require to, or I want to make sure that, I would invite you to just articulate that in writing,
Okay.
and then if I have a clarifying question, I'll respond, and then maybe we can try to respond to that in the next work session.
Can I just clarify, because one thing would be, if we all have 5 different opinions,
Right.
obviously you won't be able to come up with
Right.
anything, and as a board.
And it won't be,
We
right,
should
and
be
it
giving
won't be.
direction as a board
right.
rather than.
It won't be helpful, yeah. So it will be like some kind of couple scenarios that, or fence posts, give you a sense of some sensitivity analysis, like, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, because I want to, say target a program, or say like, what if we increase this, if we doubled this spending in this area? What does that affect to other things? Does it put us under? Does it mean we have to cut other
Sure.
areas?
Sure.
Is it not feasible to spend that much money because
Sure.
it requires hiring people that we
Yep.
can't get up to speed, whatever that is?
And if I may suggest this, it will be good if, because like you said, if you each have 5, and they're each kind of more or less the same thing, but we spend a ton of time trying to figure out this really small difference. Maybe we can do a first cut where you all articulate what that is. Lisa and I and the team take some time to like go through that and say, we really think this is fundamentally 3 or 4 options, and and
Yep.
get back to you and say, how's this? And then go from there. Do some sorting on the front end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that's okay.
So mine was more on things like, and this will probably be information that's coming next time, like grants that are currently funding things. Do we have grants that are currently funding programs that aren't going to be here next year? And what does that look like as we're looking at the budget? So outside source funding that we've had to support different things, and when do they, I don't want to say disappear, but sunset. So thank you. When do they sunset? And what does that look like? And what's the impact on our budget? Right? So, because we know we had some race to the top, and over the years we've had different things, and those start going away. So what's the impact of that?
Sure.
That would be important to know. And then I know, in years past, we have added things. I don't believe we're looking at adding things this year because we're trying to get back to where we are. But there's still programs, right, like dual language that, we've talked about for years, that can we expand that? So when does that start looking at, can we expand that type of program? Our preschool, what looks that way, and some things that we've talked about. I mean, even, I know Avid is something that's, we've looked at some, well, we've talked a little bit about what the return on investment was, or different things that way, but really starting to understand for me what certain programs that we've put in place that cost money, have we gotten the return on investment? If we haven't, what are we going to be doing differently? Not just saying, okay, we're not going to grow this or we're not going to do it, but really starting to look at those. And I know that, for this year, we might be a little bit late in that process of being able to do some of that. But I really think for going forward, that's really important that we start having those conversations early in the year of what's important and what types of things we want to see so that we can have them when we get to this point.
I need some help with that one, but
Okay. Yes, I would really like, I know in the past we've sort of lumped everything together on certain object codes or certain classifications like other, and particularly when it comes to contract services. I think this year I would really like for us to break down those contract services. What exactly is under that? Because a bulk of our expenses are under that, but we've never really had explanations as to what that is. And so more look at not just the contract, but the MOU, what is it that our partners are providing, which schools, kind of look at it. When we're looking at a budget for each individual school, I'd like to understand, what are the partnership and additional money that school is getting via contracts and nonprofit organizations. So we're looking at not just the revenue that school is getting, but not just the funding the school is getting, but the additional supports those schools are getting. And then I'm not quite sure how you're going to align that with this opportunities in LAP and, the transitional bilingual funding, all of that. But kind of an analysis to see, by school, how are they being supported in addition to the state funding. So that's one. And then also, it would be helpful to see local funding how much of it in the past we've used for classified administration. I know for teachers, we've used something like 85% of it, is what I hear. Typically, schools, school districts use that much, 85% is the number I've heard.
Total
for-
budget.
Yeah,
Usually,
yeah.
85% is personnel cost.
Yeah,
So that's
well,
total.
from the levy, the local levy, too.
Okay, so yeah, it's drilling down even.
Yeah, and so when we're talking about that cap, which is for classified, or which is for administrative.
Administrative,
I'd like to know what we have funded in the past. And if we're doing enough to reduce the amount of administrative expenses, particularly in the central office. Does that make sense? Because I want to see
yeah.
that 25% cap, how that impacts us as it is now versus down the road. Sense, Lisa? I think Lisa wants to say something then.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, with my over formula calculation, I can
Yeah.
easily pull
Okay.
that level.
Okay.
down.
All right, okay.
Okay, all right, thank you. Any other questions from? No?
Right.
Thank you, that was
Yeah.
really helpful. It's
Okay, good.
6:30
Yes, very
and we're
good.
ending on
Good.
good time. Thank you very much.
Okay, good.
Ben.
Thanks,
Very
appreciate it.
helpful. All right, we are adjourned. Have a good evening.